Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Philosophy Hour of Literary Tales. In this episode, we're exploring the philosophy of existentialism, principally as an attempt to confront the alienation and nihilism of modernity. Existentialism is an often misunderstood philosophy. It tends to be the popular philosophy of teenage nihilists, rebellious individualists, and other alienated persons who take a liking to the theme of alienation in existentialist thought. However, existentialism is not a nihilistic philosophy. On the contrary, it attempted to confront the crisis of nihilism. Moreover, despite the individualist element to it, existentialist individualism, in its Sartrean or Camusian form, is a tragic individualism that does not celebrate the primacy of the individual, but laments it and accepts it as the reality of the world in which we live in. But such individualism often misses the point. Heideggerian authenticity, for instance, is not a celebration of atomistic and alienated individualism either. Anyone who has read Being in Time would know Heidegger's ontic insight of being in the world means being with, a being in relationship to the world and others. The very essence of Heideggerian existentialist authenticity is to take the alienated individualism that you are embodying as a result of modernity and reattaching it to the world and the web of relationships. The Christian roots of existentialism are also well attested to in philosophical scholarship. This has nothing to do with Kierkegaard, but everything to do with the Christian anthropological concept of the fall of man, original sin, and Augustinian desire. In his short but concise summation of the origins and the history of existentialism, the philosophical historian William Barrett outlined how existentialism had Christian roots, going back to Tertullian and St. Augustine. The reader of Christian theological anthropology will immediately recognize many of the same themes in existentialist thought, though in its now secularized form. The crisis of love and wanting to be loved, alienation from the self and from the world, trying to find happiness but ending up engaging in only domineering and destructive behavior, seeking rationality because man is a rational animal, but seemingly incapable of attaining it. The difference between existentialism in its atheistic form with Christianity in its form is that existentialism embodies the Augustinian reality of tragedy without the hope of salvation. It is interesting to point out that Albert Camus, one of the most famous French existentialists, wrote his master's thesis in philosophy on Plotinus and Augustine, and other noted French existentialists like Sartre and Beauvoir often credited and cited Augustine repeatedly in their works. To some, this begins the grown-up version of existentialism, if you will, the embrace of the tragic reality of the world without the hope of a God to reconcile our dilemmas for us. This was, at least, Heidegger's understanding of the present moment that existentialism and the rest of the world found itself in. As such, existentialism is the embrace, simultaneously, of the reality of alienation, of the meaninglessness of life, but rather than succumbing and simply accepting this as the only path forward, existentialism offers an attempt to embrace a heroic struggle against the odds of the world, against the alienation, against the meaninglessness of life. Therefore, allowing us to create our own meaning in the meaningless world. Therefore, the impetus of existentialism is the recognition that life is defined by some sort of worrying characteristic or characteristics. There is a certain original guilt or anxiety that looms over our lives, which we are, to varying degrees, aware of. And in this awareness of this guilt or anxiety that pervades the world, we are called to strive forward and create a new meaning in this meaningless world. Those who get their knowledge of existentialism from Wikipedia receive a deeply misleading and at times wrong understanding of it. It is true that the authentic self is a concept sought after in existentialism, with differing understandings of what this means pending on the particular philosopher in question, from the rootedness of Heidegger to the pious struggler of Camus to the being for itself in Sartre. Moreover, the Augustinian roots of existentialism are best seen in existentialist anthropology, emphasizing the primacy of the will and being responsible for one's actions that they engage in. Sin has consequences becomes freedom has consequences. As Camus argued, the only question of philosophy is the question of life itself. Life is the only question philosophy concerns itself with because life is contingent to being. And the philosophical life, the philosophical adventure, is concerned with being, concerned with life. Without being, there is no life. Without life, there is no existence. Without existence, there is nothing to ponder, since subjectivity is contingent upon existence. Thus, the question of life is the question of being, the same question that Heidegger attempted to answer in his famous book, Being and Time. Camus posited the view that we live in a cold, irrational, unordered, unloving, and ultimately meaningless world. This bare facticity is at odds with our subjective desires, our desire for goodness, love, rationality, and meaning. The bare facticity of the material world, therefore, comes into conflict with the subjective desires of the interpersonal world. In essence, this is what the heart of existentialism is wrestling with, a dialectic that we also find in earlier Christian and Romantic philosophy. Part of the Christian doctrine of the fall is man's alienation from the world, symbolically represented by his expulsion from Eden. Man's alienation from himself in rejecting his rationality and favoring the world of pure id, sin. Man's alienation from others, symbolically represented by Adam's ruptured relationship with Eve, and, of course, man's alienation from God, the very source of truth and happiness and love in life, therefore preventing us from having a relationship with truth, happiness, and love. As such, the basic understanding of the Christian doctrine of the fall is alienation. Man seeks to live a good, true, and happy life, but is unable to. Man seeks relationships with others, but is alienated from them, often leading to the lust for domination, the libido dominandi, between human beings. We seek happiness, but we are unable to make ourselves happy and often find ourselves living in miserable lives. Existentialism is, as William Barrett pointed out in his book again, simply the secularization of all of Christian anthropology, philosophy, and theology. The difference between Christianity and modern existentialism is Christianity offers reconciliation, a pathway out of this misery, this alienation, this meaninglessness of life through God. Whereas existentialism says there is no God, and therefore it is only up to ourselves to persevere and to struggle unto death, creating the new meaning and the purpose of our life every moment we're alive. And this demands incredible responsibility. Existentialism, in continuing these themes, therefore places the individual at the heart of the world of value creation. This is the real individualism that existentialism is about. Recognizing that you and you alone are the source and the creator of the momentary meaning in life, and that you bear the responsibility of continuously creating meaning until the moment of your death. This is why Camus said that suicide is not a viable option in the world we live in. Suicide is a rejection of the confrontation with alienation, the confrontation with the abyss. Confronting this world of nothingness is what you are called to do in existentialism. This failure of embracing the reality of life is often found in the so-called last man conceptualization of Nietzsche. Living simply for material pleasure, living simply for the false promise of a utopian politics on earth. This is one of the reasons why Camus broke so sharply, for instance, with Sartre later in life. The desire to simply be taken care of by others is all a false alternative to the authenticity that you are called to by creating the very values in which you are to live by. So again, what exactly is authenticity in existentialism? Authenticity varies from philosopher to philosopher, but what we can say about authenticity is that authenticity lies with coming to terms with the fundamental factual nature of the world and embracing it for what it is. The meaninglessness, the cruelty, the bleakness, the barrenness of the world. Once you accept that the world is cruel, ugly, unbeautiful, that it doesn't have meaning, then you are able to create the beauty, create the meaning, create the purpose that is devoid in the world. For Nietzsche, who was one of the great forefathers to modern existentialism, this meant the embrace of the eternal struggle for life itself in its quasi-Darwinian battle for evolutionary progression. The cosmos for Nietzsche was a giant battlefield where the struggle for life played itself out. And even though Nietzsche's general philosophy was bastardized by Nazism and fascism, one should be able to see how Nietzsche did in fact serve as an intellectual godfather for these movements. Struggle, war, confrontation is the essence of Nietzschean philosophy, as we explored in our lecture on Nietzsche. How the struggle for life is what creates the will to power and the will to freedom. For Camus, the struggle, the authenticity for life was the embrace of the very nature of the absurd, to accept the absurd reality of the world and not allowing it to crush you into defeatism. This is why Camus turned to the myth of Sisyphus as his great archetypal reality to what existentialism is about. Yes, we know the meaninglessness of Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain, only for it to fall back down and for him to do it again. But so long as Sisyphus accepts this reality and he pushes the boulder up, only for it to fall back down and for him to continually repeat the process, he does not allow the emptiness of the world to defeat him. For Sartre, it was perpetually choosing to live a life for yourself rather than for others, to define life for yourself rather than to let others define life for you. All of which is a form of authentic struggle against the world of nothingness. Existentialism, therefore, was the culmination of the anti-nihilist tradition of continental and romantic philosophy. Existentialism is not, as often crudely and popularly thought, nihilism. Nihilism would represent the defeat of the individual in the cold, dark universe we find ourselves in, the acceptance of this world of nothingness, of valuelessness, of meaninglessness. But existentialism, although in some sense it accepts the nihilist understanding that the world is meaningless and has no value and nothing to offer us, existentialism actually goes beyond nihilism in articulating a philosophy of struggle, a struggle for life, a struggle for freedom, a big middle finger, if you will, to the meaninglessness of the universe, like Camus' Sisyphus. Existentialism goes beyond nihilism in attempting to argue that even though the world doesn't have meaning, even though the world is cruel, dark, and ugly, we have the choice to either allow that to defeat us or we can fight against it. And the very essence of life, according to existentialism, is the embrace of this struggle, the embrace of this fight against the nihilistic cosmos, and we must continue and always fight against it until we finally die. Existentialism straddles the unique position of being metaphysically nihilist, but ontologically meaningful. It accepts the metaphysical reality of bare facticity, of nothingness, but argues that even though we live in a world of objective meaninglessness, we can still create a world of subjective meaning. And creating the world of subjective meaning is what existentialism, in all of its variable forms, is about.